Good evening and welcome to your update on the Ukraine war today. By the way, I'm Brian. Thank you for joining me today. Glad to have you here. If you do hop in, go ahead and chime off in the comments. I will be watching for them and any questions you may have. It is Christmas Day, and I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible because your time on this holiday is valuable as well. This is the opportunity I have to get caught up from the weekend, and boy, was there a lot going on this weekend. Let's go ahead and get started right here. We'll go ahead and bust out some. There we go. The Russian Air Force is continuing to lose planes to Ukrainian forces. Just on Christmas Eve, yesterday, one Su-34 got shot down in the area of Mariupol, and another Su-30 got shot down in the Black Sea heading for Odessa. By the way, if you do hear bells in the background, that is a nearby clock tower, and it is Christmas season, so they are playing Christmas carols on the hour. So I do apologize for that. Initially, Ukraine did not confirm the Su-30 was shot down, just the Su-34 in Mariupol. They said they were studying the evidence to see what they could actually confirm. They weren't sure it was actually hit. However, later that day, they confirmed 2 jet aircraft shot down, the Su-34 and the Su-30, a whole bunch of Shaheds, and a couple of air-launched cruise missiles. So the Ukrainian air defense system is getting really firing on all cylinders. Now let's go ahead and take a look at what the Institute for the Study of War has said about the results of the 3 Su-34s that were shot down just the other day in Kherson. Russian forces are reportedly decreasing their aviation activity and their use of glide bombs in Ukraine after Ukrainian forces shot down those 3 aircraft. That would be from December 21st and 22nd. It looks like they're limiting their manned aviation in those areas and trying to intensify their ground strikes to make up for it. The thing is, the ground strikes were already struggling. They'd have to put even more hardware and forces and an effective command in order to even stand a chance at this point to overcome the Ukrainian bridgehead there. The Kiev Independent has confirmed the downing of the Su-34. There's a lot of this is just related information. But one thing I did notice, once those 3 Su-34s were shot down, all of a sudden there was a whole lot of artillery hitting Kherson. And this resulted in a lot of gas lines being broken, some civilian buildings and infrastructure being hit, explosions and fire. They went whole hog in trying to destroy a civilian infrastructure. They didn't hit back at military targets. It's almost as though they know they can't. So they went after the civilian infrastructure that may not have been directly quite as protected. That was a total of 71 shelling incidents in Kherson, and this resulted in the death of a local resident and injuries to 2 others. And kind of just more sources talking about that. Now, one of the other responses that Russia has been playing up is this idea that the same day that Ukraine shot down 3 Su-34s, Russia destroyed 6 F-16s. Now, there's some problems with that. Ukraine hasn't received their first batch of F-16s. In fact, they might get them by the end of 2023. However, my understanding is that those jets were actually redirected to be modernized with a better radar and additional updates. Pop ahead of here. And they attached a picture in Russian sources that showed this destroyed F-16. This is a fake. It's a picture that was originally shown in October of 2018 from Belgium. And it was a training incident, and the F-16 was destroyed there. But this is not a Ukrainian F-16. Now, there was some analysis going forward, this one being forwarded by Null Reports. F-16 combined with the Patriot system will be able to strike at Russian jets without entering the zone covered by Russian air defense. They have long enough range radar and capable missiles that the jets can fire without getting in range of Russian air defense. And then, of course, if the Russians get close enough, then the Patriot systems have a 120 kilometer plus range. So If the Russian jets try to overtake or intercept an F-16, a Patriot or a SAMP-T will effectively land it. And this is the information on the modernization here, just to show that I didn't just pull that off the top of my head. It was actually information that had been put out there. So we've just a really interesting information. The loss of this aviation hardware has got to have Russian pilots really being concerned. In fact, somebody's forwarding the idea that perhaps some of them might be taking, shall we say, a little bit of sick leave. Oh, my stomach hurts so bad I can't fly today. You guys better, figure this whole thing out. Without me, I'm sure that I would love to be in the air, but you know what? I'm just too sick, etc. But that's just theory at this point in time. Now, one of the interesting things that has happened is that Ukraine has started changing over their celebration of Christmas from the Russian tradition of January 7th or thereabouts, and instead going with the Western tradition of December 25th. And of course, a lot of this is just the Ukrainian Christmas traditions. I'm going to play a few seconds of this video from the Kyiv Independent. I'll put my headphones on so I can hear it too.
Hundreds of kilometers from battles raging in the country's east and south, Ukrainians in Kyiv are preparing to celebrate Christmas. In the midst of the war's darkness, Ukrainians continue the tradition as old as time itself, the one that echoes resilience of our ancestors, who, through the longest nights and the coldest days, celebrated hope and light.
And that's the type of people we're talking about in Ukraine. You know, if you look back at World War II, the London Blitz, the battle for Britain, British civilians dealt with day in, day out bombing campaigns because Hitler decided that he could prosecute and basically beat Britain into submission, to bring them to the negotiating table by bombing them constantly. And initially it looked like there might be some real effect here. And they were targeting military facilities. In fact, it was to the point at one point that the Germans were destroying all of the places that they were building aircraft, destroying the airfields that they were launching from, all that infrastructure. And then they switched to bombing civilian targets, the bombing London itself, trying to hit the people of Britain outright directly. Now, the interesting thing is that if the Germans had kept going after the British military targets, the odds are pretty good he would have succeeded, at least in entirely destroying the British Air Force and any ability to respond to Germany's attacks. And yet, when they switched to civilian targets, it literally gave them time to rebuild, prepare, and then have enough resources to win the Battle of Britain, the air war over Britain. And to a certain extent, that's what it feels like Russia is doing to Ukraine. Instead of going after the military targets and continuing in that vein, they're just hitting everything they can in hopes of destroying the spirit of the people. But the Brits said, keep calm and carry on. They just kept on being just living their day-to-day existence and continued moving forward. And that's what Ukraine is doing at this Christmas season. And by turning from the Russian tradition to the Western tradition of December 25th, it shows where their hearts truly are moving towards. In fact, I'm just going to quickly scan through this article, this opinion piece on it from the Kyiv Post again. A Ukrainian author, Yevgenia Zavali, I apologize on that pronunciation, started celebrating Christmas on December 25th back in 2014, when the rejection of everything Russian began in her life. She was criticized for breaking away from the traditions of their ancestors in the church, but she stuck by that decision. And now this is a real way to say that the Ukrainians are not part of the Russian world. They are and wish to be free. In fact, I think, let me see if I can find it real quick. Whoops, sorry. That's not what I intended to do here. Let me see if I can find it real fast here. There was a great bit here. In fact, I could probably see if I kill that and go to that. Okay, that'll be a little bit better. Let's go and see if I can find that other piece of information here. I know I grabbed it. I thought it was interesting. Okay, here it is. This is an interview with Ivan Miklos. He was a former advisor to the Ukrainian prime minister. And the question was, you lived in Kiev for several years. How has Ukraine changed over the years? I lived in Ukraine from 2014 to 2020, he said. During this time, Ukraine has changed dramatically, which Putin apparently does not understand. This was after Maidan, after the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of part of Donbass. It was then that Ukraine first united. Since then, the vast majority of Ukrainians support joining the European Union and NATO, and the country's geopolitical position has changed. Ukraine was divided even before the Maidan. The western part leaned towards the European Union and NATO, and the eastern towards Russia. The situation changed with the annexation of Crimea, when Russia and the trend towards rapprochement with it lost support in the eyes of the vast majority of Ukrainians. In short, we can say that by annexing Crimea, Putin gained Crimea but lost Ukraine. And now that I've used that, I'm going to move that out of the way so I don't retouch on that again later. But overall, this idea is that Ukraine wants to be part of the Western world, wants to be free. They want to be independent still, obviously, but they want to be out from under the heel of Russian influence. What Ukrainians are spending their money on this holiday? Food, booze, and the army. That's actually not surprising. I mean, food always, and booze certainly seems to get really, really popular when you're under wartime conditions. The fact that these people are still investing everything they can extra into the military is quite telling in my mind. It says that they support their military by and large and are willing to go the mile to try and win their freedom. Okay, got all of that right there. Let's go ahead and move on to news out of Ukraine. I'm going to take just a moment to pause here and catch my breath. Again, today's Christmas, and I do want to wish you Merry Christmas and thank you for joining me today. I am going to keep this one relatively short, but absolutely feel free to jump in and ask your questions for today. I'm not all tied up and everything, got my tie or anything like that. So, that's just to recognize that today, all of us should be thinking about peace on earth, goodwill towards men, and the Savior, and trying to overcome the challenges of this war. And for those that are in Ukraine, that are suffering under this right now, that are dealing with the air alarms and air alerts, I hope you still manage to find some happiness at this time of year for Christmas. All right, let's go ahead and move on here. Russia has been hitting humanitarian aid in Kherson for the last 5 days. This is the third one they've struck, and they just basically are trying to destroy those basic humanitarian supplies that people would be able to, survive on. This is not military hardware. This is not military targets. It's humanitarian supplies. A monument to the participants of the January armed uprising of 1918 has been dismantled in the Kiev city. The ideological purpose of this pedestal was to glorify the Bolsheviks, who orchestrated an armed rebellion against the Ukrainian Central Council and the Ukrainian People's Republic. In other words, the Russians overthrew Ukraine's government. This basically glorified the Soviets and the imperialists there, and they're trying to eliminate that influence. Interesting, unrelated entirely, they have announced a new maritime drone that can bip along at 110 kilometers per hour, about 65 miles an hour. That'll be the fastest object in the Black Sea, and it's called Mamai. Let's go ahead and move over to news out of Russia. I'm going to start off with the Institute for the Study of War. I'm going to ignore that part because it's not the most interesting part of this here. I've had to refresh my browser a few more times. But there is indications once more in Western media that Vladimir Putin is putting forth feelers towards interest in a ceasefire, and they're saying don't believe it. This is just meant to delay and discourage further Western military assistance to Ukraine than any serious interest in ending the war other than a full-on Russian victory. Pretty straightforward. It's deception and politics. The Russian central bank is saying that the country should be prepared for increased sanctions pressure. They generally thought they fared pretty well early on in the war, but there's looking like things are getting a little bit harder for them. A nuclear-powered vessel for the Russian Federation, which is a nuclear-powered icebreaker, actually caught fire. It was just in one of the cabins, not in the actual machinery rooms or anything like that, so there was no immediate risk of nuclear explosions or anything like that. But it's just interesting, and it kind of tells you that overall the maintenance on these Russian ships is starting to suffer. Russia's attention is getting a little divided, and they're preparing an expedition to Africa to search for and train mercenaries to participate in the Ukraine war. They're putting together 50 to 100 soldiers to be the core of their Africa Corps. And they're initially doing that in the Kursk region, and then they'll send them over to Africa to find soldiers for Vladimir Putin's war. The FSB over in Russia has accused a Ulan-Ude native of trying to join the Freedom of Russia Legion. Apparently, he did some text messages with the bot that would be involved there, and overall, they found out about it, and they're going to throw the book at him. I mentioned previously that a new potential contender for the presidential election in Russia has been identified, a journalist by the name of Ekaterina Duntsova. And the election commission said, no, there's problems with her application. They said they refused it because there are over 100 errors in it, which is interesting. They're obviously trying to make sure that she cannot run. 3 Russian servicemen in the Belgorod region were injured as a result of a drone attack. Just sharing this to show that the war is being carried over into Russia as well. Moving back to Miss Duntsova again here. She also went to one of, I think this is a party, Yabloko, that was approached by Duntsova to potentially basically sponsor her as a presidential contender. Apparently, they said, we don't know you, we're not interested, and of course, we've already done our Congress, so no way. Comparatively, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation nominated a 75-year-old man, Nikolai Kharitonov, as their candidate for the presidency. And he was asked, are you going to criticize Vladimir Putin? And he said, for what? He is responsible for his work cycle. I am responsible for mine. I'm not the type of person to criticize a colleague. I understand perfectly well how heavy the burden is to be the president of Russia. I think that anybody who takes the time to criticize Vladimir Putin on a regular basis tends to end up in jail or otherwise not positively inclined to life. Investment activity in the Russian Federation has slowed down sharply to pre-2019 levels. And they expect that the collapse of imports of investment goods and the slowdown in construction, amongst other potential factors, has slowed down Russia's economy. And the lieutenant general over Roscosmos has been charged with embezzling $4.5 million in Russian state funds. This is just one more sign of the ongoing corruption in Russian government. All right, so we're going to take a pause after Russia here for just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and just mute my mic for just a moment. Do you have any questions for me or any comments so far? Let me know. And by the way, at this point, if you appreciate all the news around the Ukraine war that I do chase down and get together, hit me with that old thumbs up. I'd appreciate that as well. By the way, I do have a cat here on my left side, so if the cat suddenly jumps up and ends up in my face, you'll know what happened and where it came from. It won't be random. Let's go ahead and move on to international news. Ukraine has received another $1.3 billion in financial support from the World Bank. This is to support the social and humanitarian expenditures. Foreign shareholders have bailed on a project in the Russian Arctic called the LNG-2 project. Companies from China, France, and Japan have suspended their participation due to the ongoing sanctions. I want to talk about Serbia for a little bit here, but I'm going to move this, move this over to that section and come back to it in a bit. France is putting together an artillery coalition to strengthen the Ukrainian army here, and that new artillery coalition will be basically focused on getting them the artillery shells and equipment they need, in particular the 155 and 105 millimeter shells. UK's Defense Minister Grant Shapps has said there will be severe consequences if Russia wins the war in Ukraine. If we allow Putin to win this war by dragging it out and he somehow wins it by exhausting everybody else, then we will suffer the consequences. And the consequences would be incredibly severe for Europe, for Britain, for the world. A little bit of word of warning there. EU leader Josep Borrell has said that Putin will continue the war until the final victory. In fact, there's several other sources that say basically if Vladimir Putin doesn't successfully win this war, it will mean not just the end of his presidency, but potentially the end of his life. So he may be very motivated to keep going, or at least come away with a situation that he thinks he can continue to come back from, regardless of the actual circumstances on the ground. Polish farmers have suspended a blockade at one of the border crossings over Christmas. My understanding is that this is still a flexible situation with the border crossing over there, and it just is continuing to change depending on the moment. According to Bild, Russia may attempt to attack Europe next winter, according to European intelligence sources. But they definitely, let me see if I can get the right word here. They definitely think that it'd be in the situation of the problem with the United States and their election. It suggests that Russia may launch an attack on Europe during the winter of 2024-25 if the United States finds itself without a leader following the 2024 U.S. presidential election. So that's a pretty specific set of circumstances, one that we might potentially be headed for. Hey, Casman, glad to have you here. Thank you very much for joining me. I didn't see your message on Twitter here, but I will take a look for it, and I'll see if I can respond to you. And by the way, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate having you here. Latvia has sent a total of 271 cars confiscated from intoxicated drivers to Ukraine, valuing nearly 1 million euros. I'm sure they're going to be reworking them to become some kind of military transport vehicle of some kind. Now, I follow Mr. former NATO Supreme Allied Commander James Stavridis on, which I'm sure I just butchered his name, so I apologize, Admiral. On on Twitter, and I keep an eye on what he says, and he's been watching the situation closely. He said it is a very dangerous situation, and here the real action is not actually in Kiev. The real action is in Washington. We've got to provide the military support to Ukraine. Their cause is just. And that is a genuine moral reason to support Ukraine. They are fighting for a just cause, their freedom from tyranny, their freedom to determine their own future. And I believe that is what Admiral Stavridis is stating there. Already talked about that. The mayor of London is doing a similar thing to Latvia, I think it was. And they're sending their 4x4s and other appropriate vehicles that were destined for the scrapyard to Ukraine to be used. Now, they did say this would be suitable vehicles, so likely ones that are operational but had other financial or situation or perhaps former government vehicles that were intended to be scrapped out and maybe converted into scrap metal effectively. So this is more equipment being sent to Ukraine. It's not weapons in the classic sense, but Ukraine does all kinds of crazy things. And they are able to do amazing things with anything we send them. Let's see. Kazman asks, why do you think other democracies should defend democracies around the globe? It's like a democracy theory, like they don't fight each other. Democracies around the globe should realize the outright threat that is going on in Russia and Ukraine right now. And the thing is that from my perspective, I'm seeing it happen and carry over to other places all over the place where because Vladimir Putin was not stopped in Ukraine, other strong men and dictators have been emboldened. Iran trying to stir things up with Hamas. Venezuela trying to stir things up with their neighboring country. Oh, I forgot the name right now, just that moment there. So, but they're trying to take over part of their neighboring country. There's African countries, same thing happening. They've been trying to overturn the government in Serbia. They've been trying to overturn the governments in the Baltic states. They've basically already got Hungary, and they're tying up Turkey in a yes/no. Overall, it seems like that there is a common cause for world stability in stopping Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. If we'd stopped him back then, it would have been a much cheaper stop, but now we've got to stop him all over the world and all these people. Thank you, Stephen. I didn't know about the pollution zone information there, so thank you on that. The vehicles probably cannot meet the new standards then, and that's why they may be sitting over. And that would be certainly useful for Ukraine no matter what. Already addressed that one there. Then there's an interesting situation that happened over in Riga. And that is a man chucked a grenade at a BBC Russian service, at a group of BBC Russian service journalists. The grenade looks like it was probably a flashbang, or they called it a training grenade. The man basically looked in the door, threw the training grenade at the people's feet. This stunned several people. There were no casualties. But the journalists think it was related to their professional activities as journalists. The government says they think it was a personal dispute with the bar. So take your pick on which one you want to believe here. One of the journalists that were on site there when it happened said that when we were sitting at the counter, a guy burst in, looked at us, looked into my eyes, and threw a grenade at my feet. So it seems like it was targeted directly. Now, maybe this will come out later. I have a theory, and it is just a theory. And that is that maybe he was targeting BBC Russian journalists specifically, and perhaps at the behest of the Kremlin, to try and basically suppress them and threaten them indirectly with threats to their lives to keep them from reporting facts about the situation in Ukraine. BBC Russian has been pretty good about being a relatively good source on Ukraine and the situation over there. Now let's talk about Serbia for a moment. Now this is a very much fluid situation here. There was a recent election there. International groups noted that there were irregularities, stuffed ballots, bought votes, and very much not a, shall we say, clean election in any way, shape, or form. So this has resulted in a great deal of protests, often with student protesters and young people, college students and the like. This situation really is getting rather tense. It's gotten to the point where more than 2,000 protesters were gathered at the Belgrade City Hall and demanding a review of the results. And they even broke down the doors and threw stones inside and had been going at it for several days. Then President Alexander Vučić issued an address stating that there will be no revolution happening. The clashes broke out with the police in the area. And basically, they started deploying tear gas and very violent techniques to finally disperse the crowd. The Vučić called it a color revolution, and he was, quote, warned in advance by foreign intelligence services. That's interesting because later he does say thank you to Russia in particular. Now, Vučić and Russia have had a cozy relationship in regards to these so-called color revolutions, and they've already been working to basically oppose them. That said, anything that's against their narrative is being called a color revolution. Hold on, I'm just kind of catching up with some of the things I've already said. Here's what the Parliament building in Belgrade looks like now. A lot of damage there, shattered glass, and stuff scattered here, there, and everywhere. The Russian ambassador announced that Vučić will soon publish data on who's financing and plotting protests in Serbia. This feels like, as Ivana Strodner says, who watches this area very closely, another KGB intimidation tactic. And they're blaming the United States like they do with everything in the area. So they probably already have the data falsified. Already the fix is in, for lack of a better way to say it. And of course, Vučić thanked Russian spies for warning about this color revolution attempt. That was reported in Russia Today, which should tell you a little bit about where Vučić is getting his support from. In the meantime, though, Vučić posted a picture on Instagram, sitting there eating apple slices. Definitely is not reading his room very well. We'll just put it that way. And they say that the way to look like a jerk pretty much in any movie is to have your antagonist eat an apple while saying just horrific things. So there you go. Mr. Vučić is not looking quite so good right now as his own citizens suffer under the brutal repression of his police forces. Now, just so you know that this is not information being pulled from nowhere, this is a PBS NewsHour article talking about the situation in Belgrade, Serbia there. And towards the bottom, it states, representatives of several international rights watchdogs observing the elections reported multiple irregularities during the vote, including cases of bought votes and ballot box stuffing. They also noted unjust conditions for opposition candidates because of media bias, abuse of public resources by the ruling party, and Vučić dominating the ruling party's campaign and media time allocated for candidates despite not taking part in the elections himself. So the international watchdogs say that there's some issues with this election. Do I know this is 110% the absolute gospel truth? No. I haven't from enough sources that I can reasonably state that there are issues with the election in Serbia. The thing is that this appears to be If true, this appears to be supported and even directed by the Kremlin, by the Kremlin regime, showing that they've got their fingers in Europe. They're trying to overthrow democracies and the situation like that and take control of them in any way they can. That's just the same type of thing that's happened in Ukraine. They're trying to do the same thing there, and the Ukrainians fought back. So that's kind of where I ended up with on the Serbia stuff and why I added it. By the way, I'm going to take a brief pause here. So if you have any questions or comments, by the way, thank you for what I've seen so far. Absolutely appreciate it and glad to have you all here. So thank you. I'll be going into the front lines here just next here and looking forward to moving on. Ask your questions. I'll be reading them in just a moment. Absolutely, they do, and that was one of the parallels that somebody pointed out. And for those who may not know, Belarus had a very much contested election that was rife with irregularities. If I'm going to be very generous in my assessment there, where it was basically outright cheating, and Lukashenko won the elections and then had a brutal repressive crackdown on anybody who said he didn't. Supported by, and in fact, often they state that Russian snipers and special forces actually came into Belarus to enforce the results of that election. So very much a mirror of what happened in Belarus. That's why I'm concerned about it. All right, let's move over to the front lines. New ambush tactics by the armed forces of Ukraine. And this is interesting. They take a drone and they've got a situation where they may have hit an area and there's casualties or troops that need to be evacuated. They'll take one of their drones, they'll move into a spot where it is disguised as a bush or garbage or a bundle of rubbish. They'll wait for an explosion, then an evacuation vehicle comes for the wounded, and along the path of the movement that vehicle passed, they put a new mine there. So when the evacuation vehicle goes down that same path, it hits this new mine, destroying that vehicle. Lather, rinse, and repeat. They can continue mining the area, sitting with more drones, sitting more FPV drones in there to take care of any new evacuation vehicles. And this creates basically a self-feeding ambush the longer it goes. And they just have to, the Russians will have to start watching for mines that are put into place after they've passed through an area. The problem is that usually you think you've got a clear road, and that slows you far down. So interesting what kind of tactics the Ukrainians are using. Thought that was a nice one to add and share. The intelligence update from the UK talks about the rat and mice infestation in some sectors of the front line. They had a mild autumn, ample food from the fields that were left and were not tilled or anything. So they had plenty of food in those fields, and that has caused an explosion in rodents. With colder weather, the rodents go into shelter, and they'll often shelter inside vehicles and defensive positions. Of course, that'll reduce morale, but it also causes illness, and they tend to chew on wires, cables, and insulation, destroying the vehicles that they nest in. This is just overall a nasty situation on the front lines and something that both sides are likely having to deal with right now. Overall situation on the front lines here. Let's see. I do need to fix my... I might actually work right now. Let me see if it does. Bloop. Nope, not right now. Okay. I'll mess with that later. So over here in the Liman Pershi area, just kind of a general impression is that the Russians are starting to bring in more heavy equipment, more mine clearing equipment, and trying to really step up their assault on Sinkiivka, which is right here basically in the middle of the map. They've managed to take a little bit of forested area, but they have basically run into the rock wall of Ukrainian defenses. Down near Bakhmut, we got some interesting things going on near Modanivka. Russians actually took a fairly wide front there of maybe 2 or 3 kilometers wide and managed to push forward probably about a kilometer, even 2. Mostly an open area, but tree lines and more defensible positions. A lot of work there. So we're going to step through that for the last several days when I get to that section of the front. It's an interesting one to take a look at. Avdiivka continues to hold. No real changes in lines there. Verbova and Robotna here. The Russians tried to take initiative and have took a little bit more territory, but the Ukrainians have managed to capture some back. They're basically exchanging different parts of the front line here. And the Dnieper River. The situation at Krinky continues to be held by Ukraine. And with the destruction of those 3 Su-34s and then another one near Mariupol and the Su-30 down in south near the Black Sea, it seems like it's really driven Russian aviation out of this area. And they were relying heavily on that aviation to try and overcome Ukraine's defenses. They've been unable to get their troops in there for a land or ground assault and have it actually stick. The Ukrainians have been fighting them back every time, but the one thing they couldn't really counter is the aviation. The glide bombs that would be launched from 50 kilometers out and landing on their heads. Well, the Russians aren't exactly getting all that heavy with the glide bombs now. They have basically stopped almost all of that aviation in the area for now until they determine exactly what Ukraine has done. That's a good overall on the front lines there. There was an official report finally on the capture of the remains of Marinka. You can see right here that it's basically nothing but shattered buildings and remains. This is how Russia takes territory now. They just flatten everything in their path and keep on moving. A bus depot is on fire in occupied Horlivka. They've reported the fire is particularly intense, and it makes me wonder if there might have been a fuel depot or something like that nearby. Not far away in Ilovaisk, 6 tanks of diesel fuel burned on a train track there that was targeted on December 23rd. I wonder to a certain extent if these two events are directly related to each other, but I've not been able to prove one way or another. It just indicates that Ukraine has targeted some fuel supplies. Giannis, thank you very much. Happy Christmas to you too, and to everyone else. Thank you. So additional attacks there, and I think they're attacking those supply lines. This is more about the Horlivka fire there. And this is what makes me think there might be more to it than just a bus station. That's a pretty intense fire for the type of situation that is being reported. There was some shelling in the village of Zernovo in the Suzemsky district, Bryansk region. That puts it on Russian territory. Ukraine has been more taking the fight to Russian territory to try and prevent Russia from getting too comfortable in how the lines are actually lined up right now. That said, they're not exactly majorly destructive attacks. Just overall interesting to see it happening. Bilohorivka, Kremina area. This is the new Ukrainian positions north of Bilohorivka. This means that the Ukrainians have managed to move forward just a little bit in this area. You can see this little gray area where they have, blue area where they have just recently gained a little bit of extra territory. The situation in Kupiansk that I mentioned just a few moments ago, kind of just confirming the same information already discussed, mine-clearing vehicles, and it looks like the Russians are planning a bigger mechanized attack in the next days or week. A Russian assault east of Terny, which is, let me see if I can pull that up here. If I remember right, that would be right in this area here. Let me see if I can find it now. Been long enough since I've looked up Terny. There we go. Yeah, okay, there we go. Little bit of a Terny assault here. Got into some more tree lines. That's all it is. just more open area that basically is not exactly undefended, but not as not heavily defended like others. Talking about Krinky again, the Dnieper River region here, a bunch of Russians gathered in a house. They occupied it in Krinky or near Krinky, and the Ukrainians found out about it and dropped a HIMARS on it. That took care of any of those Russian forces in there. The overall situation in Krinky is that Ukraine seems to be really on the offensive here. They've stepped up fire support in Krinky with cluster munitions, the Baba Yaga drones that the Russians hate so much. They've been mining roads, and they just feel like there's so many of these drones that the Russians are being hit with. The infantry can't move due to lack of cover. Now, they do respond with bombs, but we already talked about the situation with aviation there. They're trying, but the Russians are not succeeding. And I think they're starting to get a bit frustrated over there. Now let's look at Bodanivka a little bit closer here. There's been things going on here for the last while. This is about 21st, 4 days ago. Now watch the lines as we step. Let me step back one step here. Okay, to the 20th. Let's watch the lines as we step forward. 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd. So you saw that there was this big advance by the Russians on the 22nd. Huge gains, all open territory. And then the Ukrainians pushed them right back in the Kromova area down here. That doesn't return them back to the original lines, but it is interesting to see this happening. Bodanivka is an interesting situation. I watched another person do a long analysis on Bodanivka. The problem was that there are multiple Bodanivkas, and he picked the wrong one when he was looking at the map. And so overall, you're looking at kind of a situation here. These rivery areas are the ones with the blue line in them because they've got a river in them, are the low areas. The Russians have managed to capture a little bit of the higher territory over the street near Bodanivka. But overall, the situation is really, really a tough one for Russia right now. They've managed to push into the edge of Bodanivka to their benefit, and if they can keep pushing and not get distracted by Ukrainian forces down here near Kromova, then they will probably just flatten the whole village until they get through to the far side. It's going to depend on what resources Ukraine wants to put into holding this village. It is terrain that was pretty hard fought for and regained by the Ukrainian armed forces, and they don't want to lose it. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of this, an area to keep an eye on. The counterattack near Kromova indicates that they're probably got more resources there than the Ukrainians are letting on, and we might see a lot of action in this area in the coming days. Here's this is actually a Russian-sourced map talking about the recaptured positions in Kromova area. This is just kind of showing that the territory is being exchanged back and forth. The weather situation over there is pretty bad. Not as bad as directly in the south, but still pretty bad. Snow and bad roads and bad conditions. So any territory they take right now will then have to be dug into and protected. And depending on the weather will determine exactly how easy or hard that is. And now we're about ready to move on to the interesting extras. Do you guys have any questions for me? Absolutely would love to hear from you. And thank you, by the way, so far for making comments as we go. I do absolutely appreciate it. The situation in Ukraine is always going to be changing, and I want to make sure we stay ahead of what's going on and stay well informed about everything going on over there. All right, I'll be watching for your questions or comments, so let's continue on. This is a HIMARS launcher with Christmas lights on it. Obviously, this HIMARS launcher is well behind the front lines. It's not being used near the front at this point. Close enough they can still hit targets because they do use it to launch missiles. But they're not going to be sitting like right there in Krinky or right across in Kherson with that one all lighted up like that. Still, it's a bit cheery to see what they did. Ukrainian aviation continues to absolutely impress me. I play some flight simulators. I would not be able to reliably pull this off in a simulated helicopter with no risk of me dying. And yet there they are. They're skimming along maybe a dozen feet, 20 feet in the air. Always impresses me how they pull off this high-grade military aviation. How's this for a little funny here? Like in World War II, they called them Hobart's Funnies. That is an M250 caliber machine gun mounted to a motorcycle sidecar. Crazy. This was just interesting. NASA published a photo of a Christmas tree in space. Now, this is beautiful, and you can see the Christmas tree. They had to rotate it, use two different telescopes, modify the infrared data to make it into green instead of other colors, twiddle with the settings to give them the bright blue and white dots. But overall, they're just showing that this section of space looks kind of like a Christmas tree. A little bit of humor here from Crimean Wind. The first batch of eggs from Turkey has arrived in Crimea. I just giggled as I'll get out when I saw this one. I just don't know there's no message here. I just thought it was hilarious. And we'll end off with a little reminder here. Back December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as leader of the USSR. The Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time. That country became 15 independent republics. Now, Jason J. Smart, a journalist, states that history will repeat. Russia has less time than you think before it falls. But I just want to state that if it happened once and the conditions are right, it could easily happen again. And we're looking at a Russia that is not the Soviet Union that was there when I was a teenager, when I was young. I look at this and I realize that 1991 means that the Soviet Union I grew up understanding as the enemy ended more than 30 years ago. And yet they're trying to recreate that enemy. And this is just me talking for a little bit here. It would, in the early 2000s, when I started thinking about it, I actually thought, it would be fun to visit Russia. The big enemy that was so the big bad evil wolf. It would be interesting to visit and see Russia and just explore it a little bit, to see some of the areas there, see what it was like on that side of the curtain, even 10, 15 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and see how they were progressing, how they were getting better. I stopped seeing Russia as the enemy. And it was a big change for me. I grew up at the latter end of the Cold War. Russia was always the evil enemy. Not that I was, not in the sense that, not in the sense of a propaganda sense, but because they had always been in favor of these horrific communist regimes, these dictatorships. They'd been doing so much evil across the world, and I thought Russia had changed. And it took the 2022 invasion, because understand, I wasn't following the things in 2014, but it took the 2022 invasion to realize that the same old Soviet Union was just under a new tricolor banner. They're using the same methods and the same systems and the same way of doing things. They had the same old guy doing the same old things at the head of it. He was just in a different position. And I mourn the loss of that brief period where I believed there was peace. That doesn't mean there was, but I believed it. So that's my thoughts for today. Thank you for joining me. Any other questions before I sign off for today? Keck says, I read a comment on AMA on Reddit the other day from a Russian son of a millionaire. When asked about sanctions, he replied, I wouldn't say that our lives have changed much. Some brand stores are indeed closed due to sanctions, but their online stores also continue to operate in Russia. There is no difference, in fact. Do you think this is also true for the general public? I think that in Moscow, it's generally true. In anywhere not Moscow, okay, Moscow, St. Petersburg, partially Rostov-on-Don. Any of those areas, I think it's in fact true. That's where the millionaires and the billionaires like to live. I believe it's totally true there. I think that if you don't live in those three places, well, number one, your standard of living was already much lower, but I think it's getting much worse. Opinion, just from what I'm seeing, be interesting to see what it looks like now. And Stephen, Georgia, I'll tell you honestly, I was a young father when Georgia happened. I was not tracking anymore. Russia had fallen off my radar. And so I've had to catch up with a whole lot of history. Not that I wasn't there for much of it. I was alive. I was busy. I was just busy with a young family and the challenges of young family life. And now that I've managed to get into a spot where I can start paying attention, it tells me how much I missed. Like I said, I missed that little piece of peace that I thought existed. And yes, I realize now that I was deluding myself in believing it, but at the time, I fervently held to it. And I hate to say it, but I hope that everyone else wakes up to the exact same thing that I had to wake up to, that Stephen had to wake up to, that many others will have to wake up to when things get bad enough. Any other questions before I sign off? I appreciate you guys here. Absolutely. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays if you're not a Christmas person. I have a good friend of mine who just does not love the holiday season. So, we'll see how she feels about it when I talk to her later. But overall, just make sure you're thinking of your loved ones. And if you are believing it, Jesus Christ, make sure you keep his sacrifice in your mind. This is Christmas, so I'm definitely touching on things I wouldn't normally touch on, but absolutely thank you for joining me. Stephen says, I had hope at the time as well, of course. Remember Winds of Change by Scorpions. Yeah, things have certainly changed a lot. And I was looking forward to a world. I had hopes of a world where I wouldn't have to think about the crawling up. I'm old enough. I got taught how to crawl under my desk in the event of a nuclear attack. I was close enough to military facilities that would be absolutely targets, that the area I lived in would have been targeted. So not that crawling under my desk would have made any difference, but that's what they taught you at the time. So overall, it is the world we live in, and it's time to lose the blinders and make certain I'm watching. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. You have a great rest of your day. Merry Christmas, and we'll see you on the next video.